Hi, everyone, and welcome back. What's going to be happening for the next few episodes is since it seems like a lot of you enjoy British Imperial history, we should probably go back to the first British Empire, and probably after that, I will start tackling Elizabeth the First and her foreign policy and her involvement in the Dutch Revolt. So, what is the first British Empire? The first British Empire is the incarnation of British expansion pre American Revolution, which for many people they consider the American Revolution and the throwing off of British imperialism in the 13 colonies, soon to be 13 states, as the end of the First British Empire. The First British Empire isn't really anything too different from the Portuguese Empire in the sense that, in a lot of ways, these were trade ventures and more of expansion of mercantile policies. They were a mixture of state and private ventures that would set up a lot of factories or and trading posts in areas like Muscovy, West Africa, and the early expansion of imperial ventures into India. Now, what kind of started the first British Empire was a consolidation of English identity and the state under the Tudors and Stuarts. And a lot of that also is tied with the Irish plantation system that saw at first Norman and later Tudor and Stuarts expand into Ireland, and with a split between the English and Catholic Church and a rebellion against more concentrated power in Ireland, confiscation of lands, which would lead to the state of, for instance, different identities of Northern and Ireland from the rest of Ireland, with Ulster being primarily a Protestant part of a generally Catholic island. And so so one thing to kind of note is even with the rise of private trade and establishment of trade routes, we also need to kind of recognize that the English state during the Tudors was one of what I would call great personality, but not necessarily stability, as while while we may remember Elizabeth the First as a golden age, living during that time, especially of the time before her under Edward, Mary, and her early reign, things weren't necessarily stable. And while under her reign and those of her successors, we see establishment of fisheries in Newfoundland and taking of frontiers from the French and Spanish. It wasn't that stable or that easy. And all honesty, her greatest success during this period, when it comes to foundation of trade routes and imperialism, was probably establishing trade with Muscovy. And part of the challenge was justifying conquest, settlement, and the utilization of religion, because during this time we were dealing with a papal bull soon after Columbus. The papacy tried to influence imperialism and religion by dividing the world basically between Portuguese and Spanish influence. With the rise of Protestantism, that bull was thrown out, and the idea of instead of spreading Catholicism, it was spreading Protestantism. And you will actually see a lot of this in early Native American history and early colonization of praying Indian settlements. So, so, and with this in mind, as the 13 colonies got established, and the the English were putting settlements in Ireland, confiscating land, and creating at first what would become a generally successful textile industry thanks to uh, increased amounts of flax. We need to question what was the whole point of settlements, and that was in a lot of ways finding raw goods and creating either places where there could be some light work in creating industrial finished goods, which, despite some myths, we actually do see some of that in the 13 colonies. But it was also creating sources where goods could be produced, like New England grain, sugar colonies in the Caribbean, tobacco in Virginia, which would be fueled by increasing populations of German, Scots, English, Welsh, and an attempt at Anglicanization, and because of the more hands-off approach of English colonization, increasing freedoms, which, if any of you are a fan of Sam Aronow, you will kind of realize that in a lot of ways, like groups that were minorities, like Jews, did, while not a huge part of the population, and I put emphasis on religious minorities, in a lot of ways, for people of different religions like Jews, while they wouldn't be in great numbers until the 1860s and onwards, um, there, in a lot of ways, religious emancipation was kind of more on its way in the 13 colonies than in the old world. And a lot of that is because of the nature of the English colonial system in its first empire, and that is because it was based in trade. And a lot of the reasons why England could start focusing on trade, especially during and post Tudors, is because this is when evolutions in ship design, firepower really start coming about for England. For most of the reign of Henry and Elizabeth, they were in the midst of a reorganization of the military that had a while still was more focused on private ventures with mercenaries and employing foreigners and also mustering and utilization of lords to lead their militaries, as they were still on the road of a military revolution, especially as they start adopting a galley system and were kind of on their way into making their famous man of wars. While it wasn't there yet, by the time you get to the 1700s, you will see the finished product of the English Revolution when it comes to their military. And it's because of this reorganization of the military and the Elizabethan approach to final ventures and starting being more open minded about colonization that you do see, for instance, Cromwell's war against the Dutch and slow expansion into the Indies by taking Jamaica. So now we do need to talk about what will probably be a very controversial point, and that is the first empire in the Caribbean, West Africa. Now, the reason why England was able to expand into the Caribbean is because, while in theory, Spain was in charge of the islands, the truth is because, unlike the mainland of South America and Central America, there was no gold or silver to be found on these islands. And because that, and Cromwell, we see England, France, and other monarchies, kingdoms, and empires start to enter the Caribbean because of how well tobacco, indigo, and other cash crops that will eventually lead to sugar. Which leads to the issue of if these if the focus is on cash crops, not really settlement, who are going to be the laborers? And that is where this story starts taking a dark turn. And that is, well, at first, because of the crime waves that often comes with the slow industrialization and centralization of states, especially with poor laws, you have indentured servants, but as anyone who knows the history of Haiti, people die fast, especially in production of sugar. Which leads to the fact that utilizing indentured servants, it did work at first, with demand and turnover, you get the rise of the African slaves. And which leads to the fact that you need a constant supply of slaves, especially for Barbados and Jamaica. While with Jamaica, you do get the Maroons, who are people who will make settlements in central Jamaica for escaped slaves and will be a thorn in the side. You still get slave codes and the issue of the Dutch Navigation Acts and the Anglo-Dutch Wars, and which leads to the rise of the return monarchy after Cromwell and establishment of royal governors and assemblies because as the Caribbean became a very important part of the First Empire and a very important part of the early part of the Second Empire, keeping control of the Caribbean would be a large part of the imperial state. So now we get the African coast. So England at first wasn't that concerned with the West African coast. They were they would utilize it and their early alliance with Portugal to have some trade and some word in factories there. But but as Portugal would join a union with Spain, the Iberian Union, there would be more competition for England and later Britain to try and take forts in areas such as Ghana and some outskirts. They would be joined in this effort by the Dutch. And there would even be a company, the Royal African Companies, but nothing really came out of this. And England's influence in West Africa would be very confined. And so what happened instead was, for at least as far as the First Empire was concerned, and that is they would have some influence and gain slaves and forts by trading arms with local African rulers. What really was kind of their big success was their influence in Asia, which, like, a lot of the story would start with building factories in Africa and the Cape and having trade ties with Muscovy and the Company of the Levant. Eventually, with interest in Asia growing in Elizabethan England, the final push for monopoly was created under the East India Company, which, if you watch my videos on the British Raj, you kind of know how this story ends, but let's start with where the story begins for now. And that is early attempts at creating trade ties in Sumatra for pepper, China for porcelain, and Japan for silver, which did succeed. This trade, along with Africa, would help push for the incarnation of the Second Empire. Later, under James I, a settlement and factory in Gujarat, settlements in Bombay and Bengal would occur and would see the growth of trade not only in spices but also in cotton. But as time goes on, the East India Company had to give up on trading in Sumatra, and a costly war with the Dutch would end hopes of taking Indonesian spice from them. Trade with China slowly become official, and under the Qing gain rights to trade in porcelain tea that would be very important later centuries, especially with opium wars. As for India, despite a costly war with the Mughals and accepting Gujarat was a loss, they were able to sense and aid in Mughal weakness in the periphery, which uh, which would be the rise in their involvement in Bengal and the use of sepoys. But while it seemed like the East India Company was succeeding and making gains, the reality is the East India trade was costly and prone to losses and need for capital. Alongside this, without royal patronage, the company is open to criticism from their rivals, which saw rival companies come and go and a new monopoly form, but one that would be combined with the old East India Company. Now we need to come back to Ireland. The growth of colonization and the building of empires really saw its beginning in Ireland. Colonization of the British Isles, the focus was on a system of spreading culture and reigning the more barbarous Gaelic and border areas of the Isle, like the Highlands, Ireland, the Isles, and other territories not totally under the Tudor Stuart reign, which many of you might know, especially if you ever seen Highlander, you know this will eventually end with the Highland clearances. The system involved utilizing the Protestant religion, removing Catholic elements and ways of life, Catholic laws that would really push Ireland into rebellion and later would be a very important factor in the loss of life in the Irish potato famine. Helping push forward the tenant system in place in Ireland alongside enclosures, reinforcing trade and push for trade in money rather than in kind, breaking apart the clan elements of society and reinforcing British culture and the English language, and also taking land from rebels and distributing it to those that could be trusted. The implementation of the system wasn't a sure thing, as the 9 Years' War, while justifying land confiscation, also showed limitations of the plantation system that was being put in place. While the debts caused by land development and closure and creation of manors and laws restricting retainers and clans helped minimize clan influence, it was also restricted thanks to James Stewart's knowledge of the rivalries of his lords. As Cromwell rose and fell in the wars with the James II Jacobites occur, seizing and selling of Catholic lands and hopefully gain more Protestant interests, came and went. Unfortunately for those involved, the reality of the situation was a lot of these lands went to older plantations and later the supporters of William of Orange. This had the weird side effect of, instead of fueling growth and industry by Protestants, we see absentee landlords with estates ran by agents. The growth of a domestic homecraft trade of the Irish, the growth of flax planting to fuel the linen making industry, while did see occasional spikes and falls during war and occasional fads, especially during the Napoleonic Wars. Attempts at growing a livestock industry was attempted, but went boom and bust rather quick. While settlement did occur, they mostly occurred in township boom, and in Ulster the growth of towns became too much, and while did create a large merchant class to fuel trade, the reality is They would form a majority Protestant parliament that vastly overestimated the amount of new Protestant settlements and would be in conflict with the Catholic Irish. Now, this is going to be where we go from looking at the growth of the empire and looking inward at England itself, and not just at the military. Which, this might be a very boring part of the episode, but it's a very important part. The changing of the physical military state was one which had some foundation in the late Stuart period. Now, this changing in fiscal policy will be a very important part of seeing why Britain could rule so much while always being overstretched. And a lot of that is with the navigation acts and wars with the Dutch and with the creation of interest in naval policy or blue water policy, all this is going to be very important. But changed as distaste for James II and mistrust of the late Stuart dynasty pushed them towards William of Orange and James's daughter Mary, who was married to William of Orange. In order to thwart the Jacobites and preserve the new dynasty and promises of civilian parliamentary powers in finance and wars, and some opinion in foreign policy, we have the need for a bigger government, but one that was constrained by fear and country ideology, which meant the government would grow but must be kept in check by those who allow the growth. While things like investments in ports and greater navy meant that industries of war became heavily invested by the government, it also meant the need for financing. The need for financing was a struggle because of the fear of an independent crown and an oppressive state, and trying to leash things with short-term taxes and borrowing. This also led to a watchdog system that, while not preventing all corruption, kept a lot of people honest. As wars with France dragged on, the growth of the army and navy led to a situation where they became ruled by the civilian government like the admiralty and tethered to the parliament by pay, but while the navy stayed funded, the army could be reduced and put in limited peacetime standing. Armies in areas like Ireland and only called on to put down riots and smuggling. The issue of the change in financing led to the need of organizing debts and making the interest lower and availability of credit, which led to the creation of the Bank of England and the South Sea Company. Having a long-term debt, but one that you can pay the interest on, keeps people confident, and paying the principal only comes into play when you need to control the growth. This fear also ensured issues of government and politics were by law kept out, and only the highest members of the government administration could have seats in the government and must be re-elected. With the growth of government and the growth of the military, the need for clerks, officers, and administrators leads to the creation of patronage and family dynasties of government workers and military men, usually from landed families. These jobs promise steady income, and occasionally you will see some corruption, but promotions and maintaining positions also required competence, hence why you have families like the Pitts and Walpoles, who dominated both politics and government administrations of the period. Alongside this, the task of collecting taxes went into the hands of the government, who created a regulated system that while some skimming happened, they were not comparable to Britain's enemies. Although Britain didn't have a military school for the army, much of the officer class was literate and could read military handbooks, which covered much of the education of war back then. Now, the next important block in the creation of the first British Empire is urbanizing and maintaining agricultural output despite the tremendous growth of jobs in financial areas, industrialization, insurance providing, and shops. This growth in infrastructure tying the island together meant that we have a complex economy that had specialization in different sectors and areas that were also mobilized when the time called for it. Alongside this, jobs were being provided, taxes on custom and excises were being done, and the Navy and Merchant Marine kept lanes of trade open, although loss of cargo during war wasn't a surprise. The result of this professionalization and growth meant that servicing credit, collecting taxes, and organization of trade and resources to propel the military when needed. It meant that Britain could subsidize allies and have an army in the field while dominating the waves, which allowed for amazing victories such as the 7 Years' War, but left alone like the War of American Independence, had to face that the system couldn't support a coalition that saw them as being too powerful. In conclusion, because of the time and of England and later Britain dedicated to staying out of major wars on the continent, it gave England time to trade and save money. While they would get involved in Ireland, Ireland, as they saw, was a sphere of influence. So, in the end, all this is important blocks and tethers for for why Britain in this first imperial empire already had the seeds of their second imperial empire and how the system was already in place for rule Britannia. Thank you for listening and sorry that this was such a crazy episode.